In the 2023 presidential election, Peter Obi won more votes in some northern states than the combined total of the two major parties did in those same states just 8 years earlier. Let that sit for a moment. So here's the question that nobody in Nigerian political media is asking. If the North truly rejected Peter Obi, about Peter Obi's political model threatens the architecture that has governed this country since 1999. By the time we get to the middle of this video, I am going to show you that this was never about ethnicity. The real fight is over something that has nothing to do with where Peter Obi was born. So, what exactly does the North, or more precisely the Northern political establishment, actually fear? Stay with me. Before we go further, if you are new here, Naija Update 24/7 exists for one reason: to give every Nigerian, wherever you are, whatever region you're from, the political analysis that mainstream media won't touch. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. Let us start with what actually happened. Not the version the headlines gave you, but the structural version. Peter Obi did not simply enter the 2023 race and split a vote. That framing is too small for what he actually did. He introduced a new political language into Nigerian public life, a language built around accountability metrics, budget transparency, and lean government. And that language did something that established parties had not seen in a long time. It traveled. It crossed state lines, crossed religious lines, and found resonance in places that were not supposed to receive it: Kaduna, Kano, Gombe. Now, the question is, who resisted that and why? The resistance to Peter Obi was not a grassroots northern phenomenon. Ordinary northern voters are not a monolithic bloc, they never have been. The resistance was coordinated through institutional channels, emirate structures, the Northern Governors Forum, and the established APC party machinery that had already committed to Bola Tinubu's candidacy through internal negotiations long before the general election. The North versus Obi framing that dominated media coverage was in large part a construction. The real actors were not ordinary northern citizens, they were institutions protecting institutional interests. And here's why this conversation is resurfacing right now. The Tinubu administration is navigating real economic turbulence, the aftershocks of fuel subsidy removal, naira depreciation, and a cost of living pressure that every Nigerian family is feeling. In that environment, Peter Obi and the Labour Party have not disappeared. They remain a politically alive alternative, and quietly, behind closed doors, northern political actors are reassessing their alliance structures ahead of 2027. One more piece of context before we go deeper. Nigeria's power-sharing arrangement, the idea that the presidency rotates between North and South, was never written into the constitution. It is an elite agreement, an informal compact between political establishments. And that compact has always had one unspoken condition: the southern candidate who benefits from rotation must accept the rules of the game. They must work within the existing patronage architecture. Peter Obi, whether by design or by the nature of his record, represented a candidate who appeared unwilling to accept those rules. And here's what almost nobody has said out loud. The real threat Peter Obi posed was not to the North as a region, it was to a class of people, North and South, who depend on the current system to survive politically and financially. That is a completely different kind of threat, and it produces a completely different kind of resistance. To understand the resistance, you have to understand the institutions involved, because this is not a story of feelings, it is a story of systems. Start with INEC, the Independent National Electoral Commission. After the 2023 election, the BVAS technology and the result transmission controversies became major fault lines. But notice what happened. Institutional trust was weaponized selectively. Which region was calling INEC credible and which region was calling it compromised shifted depending on where the results were going. That tells you that the institution itself was not the issue. The institution was a tool in a larger contest. Then there's the judiciary. The Presidential Election Petition Tribunal and the Supreme Court rulings that followed 2023 demonstrated something important. Legal challenges have structural limits when political consensus has already formed around a result. The courts are not independent of the political environment they operate in. They are part of it. The National Assembly matters here as well. Northern legislative blocs hold significant influence over appropriations, oversight committees, and constitutional amendment processes. Any incoming administration that plans serious structural reform needs legislative cooperation. Without it, reform proposals die in committee. This is not a uniquely Nigerian dynamic. It is how legislative power works everywhere. But in Nigeria's case, it means that even a reformist president faces institutional friction that is built into the architecture before they take a single policy decision. And then there are traditional institutions, emirates, traditional councils, the structures that Nigerians sometimes dismiss as ceremonial but which function, in practice, as political infrastructure. They are mobilization networks. They grant or withhold legitimacy. In close electoral contests, that function is not symbolic, it is decisive. Now, what does the Constitution actually say? Section 14 sub 3, the Federal Character Principle, mandates balanced representation in federal appointments. But every administration since 1999 has applied that principle selectively, using it when convenient and setting it aside when it is not. The 1999 Constitution contains no provision for power rotation. None. The rotation agreement is entirely an elite political convention, which means it has no legal enforcement mechanism. Any candidate from any region has the constitutional right to run and win. But legal rights and political reality are two different instruments. The ambiguity, the space where the real contest happens, sits in the gap between what the Constitution permits and what the political establishment will accept. A candidate who wins constitutionally but disrupts the elite consensus enters that gap immediately. The system then deploys every available tool, institutional, legal, narrative, to manage the disruption. Peter Obi's post-election legal challenges illustrated exactly that gap. And I want to plant something here that I will come back to shortly. What Peter Obi's governance record in Anambra actually demonstrated, and why that track record, not his ethnicity, is what produced the most sophisticated resistance. We will get there. Now, if what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes everything. Let us talk strategy, because at this level of politics, everything is calculated. Who benefits from the narrative that the North hates Peter Obi? APC strategists benefit directly and significantly, because if that narrative holds, it forecloses Obi's path to Northern coalition building. It makes any Northern politician who aligns with Obi appear to be betraying regional interests. It is a narrative that functions as a political fence, keeping potential crossover voters contained. PDP legacy networks also benefit. A strong Labour Party keeps the southern opposition fragmented. If Obi's voters cannot be recaptured by PDP, they become a floating bloc that threatens both major parties, which neither can afford. And media ecosystems tied to existing political patrons benefit, because ethnic conflict narratives generate engagement. They keep audiences emotionally activated and away from the structural questions that would make those same patrons uncomfortable. Now, flip the question. Who risks losing influence if Obi-style politics normalizes? Governors whose budget management has never been subjected to genuine public scrutiny? Federal legislators whose constituency project allocations function as personal patronage funds? Contractors and procurement networks embedded in federal ministries, and I want to be precise here, those networks exist in every geopolitical zone of this country. This is not a northern problem or a southern problem. It is a governance problem with a national address. Now, here is the part I promised you. When Peter Obi governed Anambra, he left a cash reserve. He reduced the state's dependence on federal allocations. He published budget documents. For many Nigerian political actors, that is not admirable. It is dangerous. Because if one state governor demonstrates that you can govern without stealing, it raises a question that every Nigerian voter can eventually ask about every other governor. That is an existential threat to the current system, and that threat has no ethnic address. That is the real reason the resistance to Peter Obi was so organized, so consistent, and so cross-party. It was not ethnic solidarity, it was institutional self-preservation. Now, what does 2027 look like from a strategic standpoint? Labour Party's structural weakness is real and should not be minimized. They do not have deep party machinery at the local government level. The risk is significant that Obi's coalition fragments between those who want to build a genuine party from the ground up and those who want him to defect back into the PDP structure. Northern political actors are watching LP's ward-level infrastructure closely, because if Labour cannot build that infrastructure before 2027, the 2023 result represents a ceiling, not a floor. The Southwest calculation is complicated. Tinubu's base consolidates Yoruba political identity in ways that make Labour Party penetration difficult in that zone. But economic hardship is a solvent that dissolves identity politics over time. If the cost of living continues to rise, the question which party will fix this begins to compete with which party is our party.
The Southeast, Obi's nominal home base, is politically constrained by the security situation and by IPOB dynamics. He cannot campaign freely in the zone that should be his strongest. That is a structural disadvantage that receives very little analytical attention. The strategic prize is the Middle Belt. States like Plateau, Benue, and Nasarawa have cross-cutting identities. They have demonstrated repeatedly a willingness to vote outside ethnic lines. Whoever wins the Middle Belt in 2027 will have changed the electoral map. Let us talk about what all of this means for ordinary Nigerians. Not political actors, not analysts, but the people who live with the consequences of these decisions. If third force politics becomes genuinely viable in Nigeria, it destabilizes the revenue-sharing negotiations between Abuja and state capitals. Governors whose political survival depends on federal transfers rather than on internally generated revenue face existential pressure if a reformist federal administration gains power and starts asking questions about how those transfers are spent. This is why the resistance to Obi-style politics is bipartisan. It crosses APC and PDP lines cleanly because it threatens both. The economic consequences for ordinary Nigerians are not abstract. Infrastructure deficits, healthcare system collapse, youth unemployment at levels that should be treated as a national emergency, these are the measurable outputs of a patronage-based governance system. The system is not failing accidentally. It is producing exactly what it was designed to produce: resources concentrated at the top, distributed selectively downward as political loyalty is required. If the political elite's incentive to maintain that system is stronger than the pressure citizens can generate to reform it, the economic trajectory does not change, regardless of who wins in 2027. The interfaith and interethnic dimension is worth examining carefully here because 2023 told us something important. When economic grievance is acute enough, religious and ethnic identity becomes less determinative. Young Muslim northerners voting for a Christian Igbo candidate, not in numbers large enough to change the outcome, but in numbers significant enough to register, represents a shift in the underlying social contract. That shift is not permanent. It is reversible if economic conditions improve under the current administration. But if they do not improve, that shift deepens, and deepening shifts become structural over time. Here is the uncomfortable truth that no pundit will say clearly. The question is not whether Nigeria is ready for Peter Obi. The question is whether Nigeria's political class, North, South, East, and West, is ready to lose the privileges that the current system guarantees them. That is a completely different question, and the answer to that question will determine the answer to everything else. Briefly, because the international dimension matters, but it matters less than Nigerians sometimes assume. The US State Department and EU observer missions flagged irregularities in the 2023 process. They did not make formal determinations that changed outcomes, and they will not, because Western governments are primarily interested in Nigerian stability, counterterrorism cooperation, and energy access. Democratic reform for its own sake is not their primary objective. External pressure for Nigerian political reform is structurally limited. Nigerians who are waiting for Washington or Brussels to resolve this are waiting for something that will not arrive. What the international dimension does affect is investment. Nigeria's ability to attract foreign direct investment is directly tied to governance credibility. Investors watching the Tinubu administration's economic reforms are doing so against the backdrop of political uncertainty. 2027 is already a factor in long-term investment calculations, which means the political contest has economic consequences that arrive before the election does. For Nigerians in the UK, the US, and across Europe, here is what you need to understand specifically. The diaspora's political engagement in 2023 was significant not just emotionally, but financially and organizationally. And the reason diaspora political voice carries a different weight is structural. Diaspora Nigerians cannot be offered government appointments or contractual allocations in exchange for their political alignment. The patronage instrument that disciplines domestic political behavior does not reach you. Your voice in this conversation matters precisely because it cannot be purchased the same way. Let me give the opposing argument their fair weight, because serious analysis requires it. The first argument, Peter Obi simply did not have the national structure to win. This is partially true and intellectually honest. Labour Party's organizational capacity was genuinely weaker than APC or PDP at the local government level. That is a real structural limitation, but it does not explain why the resistance to Obi extended beyond electoral competition into active delegitimization. You do not delegitimize a candidate who simply lacks structure. You ignore them. The intensity of the response tells you something about the nature of the threat. The second argument, the North voted its interests, and that's rational democratic behavior, also partially valid. Every voter bloc votes its perceived interests. That's how democracy works. But Northern interests is not a monolithic concept, and flattening it into one is analytically dishonest. A Kano market trader's interests are not identical to a Sokoto governor's interests. A Plateau farmer's interests are not identical to a Northern senator's interests. The political narrative collapsed that distinction deliberately, and we should notice that it was collapsed deliberately.
Once again, kindly remember to subscribe to my channel. I understand it means nothing to you, but it means everything to me. This work of research and analysis cost me a lot, and the only means of paying me back is your subscription. Thank you. The third argument. Obi's governance record in Anambra is exaggerated. Legitimate scrutiny of any leader's record is always healthy. But the scrutiny applied to Obi's Anambra record was rarely matched by equivalent scrutiny of the financial governance records of those who opposed him. That is a selective standard. And a selective standard is not analysis, it is politics wearing analysis as a costume. We started with one question. Does the North hate Peter Obi? And the answer, if you have stayed with this analysis, is that hate is the wrong word and the wrong frame entirely. What exists is something more calculated and more rational than hate. It is the institutional resistance of a system that knows exactly what it would lose if a different model of governance became the standard. That system has no single ethnic address. It operates in Abuja, in state capitals, and in party secretariats across every region of this country. The real story of 2023 and of 2027 is not North versus South. It is the Nigerian people versus the architecture of governance that has under-delivered for 3 decades. Where you stand on that question is where your vote will eventually land. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one Nigerian who needs to understand what is really happening. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Naija Update 24/7, we never stop watching.